Hello there, everyone. The other day, I got a comment on one of my videos asking about how to do an SPD input on leverless controllers, such as this leverless controller that you are looking at right now, the Snackbox Micro. So I thought I should make a video showing you guys not only how to do an SPD input on leverless, but I also want to talk about the pros and cons of doing an SPD input on leverless versus stick. Spoiler, I actually think the cons are very insignificant and are definitely outweighed by the pros, hence why I have been using a leverless controller such as this while playing Zangief in Street Fighter 6. So, two things you should know about SPD inputs or full circle inputs is that, well, one of them is the reason why I put quotes around full circle, and that's because you actually don't have to do an entire full circle, at least in Street Fighter 6. I think it was also the same way in Street Fighter 5. I haven't played all the Street Fighter games, so I don't know if it's true in every game. But at least in Street Fighter 6, I know that you don't have to do an actual full circle input. It's not actually a true 360 degrees. You can do a full circle, and if you're playing on stick, I would encourage you to try to go a little bit more than necessary just to be safe, right? But in reality, you actually only have to do 3/4 of a circle. The second thing, this one might not be as obvious, is that you actually don't have to input the diagonals for a full circle in this game. So you don't have to actually go from forward to down forward to down back to up. It only cares about the cardinal directions, which is unlike a half circle, which is actually why I think the full circle input, ironically, is actually easier on leverless than a half circle input, because with a half circle, you have to actually make sure you're hitting the diagonals. And so you need to make sure that your fingers are pressing and lifting all at the right time, because if some of your fingers aren't lifting at the right time, you might actually be getting the wrong inputs when it comes to half circle. So that's actually why I think full circle input is easier on leverless. So if you don't actually need to worry about the diagonals, here is an easy way to do it. So instead of inputting the first part of the 360 input as if you were doing a half circle, like I was just demonstrating, instead of doing this, instead of playing it like a piano, making sure you hit those diagonals, you can actually take one finger and slide it. So sometimes you'll hit the diagonals depending on the angle of your finger, maybe how fat your finger is. I have pretty slender fingers though. So typically I'm not going to be hitting the diagonals here. If I do it like this, see? If you see on the input history, it's going from forward to down to back with no diagonals. And so then the only cardinal direction that it is lacking is up, which is this button right here on leverless, right? And so obviously if you're doing an SPD on the ground, if you're not masking it in some other kind of move such as that, you need to make sure that you end with up, right? Even on stick, you would have to make sure you end the SPD motion with up if you're not locked into some kind of move, because otherwise you'll be jumping, right? If you try to pass by up and then finish the move, if you start the SPD input holding up, you're going to jump, right? Which you might want to do in some cases, but if you're wanting to do it grounded, you need to make sure you end with up, because you'll have a little bit of a window during the pre-jump frames to press the button. If you're too late, obviously, you're going to get it in the air. That actually lets you Tiger Knee SPD in this game, which I'll get to. But if you want to do it grounded, you need to make sure you press up first. But because you can reach up with your right hand on leverless, I would actually say just treat pressing up and the punch button as a single input. So even though it's technically supposed to be a full circle input, it actually feels as if you're just doing a half circle. So you would slide your finger like this for the half circle, and then when you press the punch button, just press the up button almost at the same time. This is going to be the trickiest part, at least for me when I first started doing SPD motions on leverless. I would have to make sure I would deliberately press up just barely before pressing punch, because obviously, like I said, you want to make sure you press up before punch, because otherwise you're not going to have the full input ready. So if you do half circle back and then press the punch button and then press up, you're not going to get the Piledriver, like so, right? So I would practice doing this, but make sure that you press the up button with your thumb before you press the punch. And if you're not good at it, you might want to exaggerate it, right? So make sure you press up way before you press punch. And it's okay if you end up going in the air because you're training yourself to press up before the punch button. And as you do this more and more, you can try to close the gap between the two. So eventually, you'll just instinctually press up before punch, even though it feels as if you're pressing both at the same time. So as you can see, this is very fast. This is much faster than my fastest SPD on stick, which is the first pro. The first pro is that this is way faster. The second pro, which is another big deal, is that because you don't have to get the diagonals, it's actually extremely easy to mask the buffer for an SPD. So let's say you want to buffer it in neutral or in an Oki situation. Let's say I want to knock down my opponent and I'm now in an Oki situation. Let's say I want to shimmy him, right? I can shimmy him by doing this, by sliding my finger back and forth, because I'm constantly buffering the half circle here. Remember, with full circle inputs, it doesn't matter where you start the circle. So you can start with holding forward and sliding back. You can start with back and sliding forward. The game doesn't care. I accidentally fat-fingered and got EX there, but my point still stands. So it doesn't matter if you start with forward or back. So at any point here, if I'm buffering this input, which is extremely good in Oki situations, I can just press up and a punch at pretty much the same time. Of course, when I say pretty much at the same time, I mean, remember, up needs to be pressed first, and an SPD will just come out. So it almost feels as if I'm doing it with one input after just simply buffering the half circle. So the reason why this is so much better on Leverless is because, remember, as I was saying, on stick, actually, I don't remember if I said that in this take or if it was another take. I've done a few takes on this video already because I've done several takes because I keep on thinking it's taking me too long to get to my point because I kept on wanting to put some beginner explanation stuff. But this video is being made assuming you guys already have some beginner level understanding of what an SPD is and how certain things work. So if you have any questions about stuff like that, just ask me in the comments. So anyways, my point is that when you're playing on stick, if you want to do this same technique of buffering part of the SPD like this, it's going to be a lot more telegraphed because inherently, because you're having to physically travel the stick, because you're having to physically move the stick from forward to down, it's going to have to travel in between forward and down, and so you're going to get the diagonals no matter what, right? Maybe if you're really good at it and if you practice a lot, you could try to just hit the cardinal directions on stick, but that would be really weird and tricky, and you wouldn't really be able to do it consistently, at least consistently fast. At least I think so. Maybe someone can prove me wrong. But anyways, that would be really difficult, right? Whereas in this case, it's really easy to only hit down because, like I said, unless your finger is really fat, you're not going to hit the diagonals. So I'm masking the input so well here because unless the opponent has a really keen eye or if they're specifically looking out for it, most opponents aren't going to notice that I'm actually inputting down here. It's going to look as if I'm just shimmying them for a regular throw, right? And so if they see this, they're going to think I'm just trying to shimmy a regular throw, and so if I'm from this distance, they might not actually worry about a throw. But what they don't realize is that I'm actually buffering an SPD, and I can actually grab them with light SPD from there. So this works really strong in a lot of Oki situations, like I said. Whereas on stick, if you are inputting a half circle back and forth constantly, it's going to look more like this. Your crouch is going to be a lot more noticeable, right? Because you're not just hitting down in between forward and back, you're hitting 3 different inputs which make you crouch. You're going to go from forward to down forward, which is a crouch, to down, which is a crouch, to down back, which is a crouch, to back. So you're naturally going to have 3 times the amount of crouching if you're inputting a half circle back and forth on stick. So I don't hear many people talking about this, but I think this is one of the main pros of SPD on Leverless. Obviously, people talk about the speed. That one's more obvious. That's why I led with that one. But I really wanted to talk about this one because I think this one's pretty nasty. Obviously, sometimes I'm not able to do it as good as other times, which actually leads me to one of my cons. And that is the fact that because you are sliding your finger across this, the feeling of it is going to change based on how sweaty your hands are. So maybe you guys don't have this problem, but for me personally, the reason why I actually switched from pad to fight stick in the first place is because I get really sweaty hands. And I would drop inputs all the time on pad if my hands got super sweaty, and I was getting really annoyed by that, right? And I eventually realized that with a fight stick, because I can wine glass grip a fight stick, right? Pretend the stick is here. If I wine glass grip the fight stick and hold onto the ball top that way, it doesn't matter how sweaty my hands are so long as I am holding on to that stick, right? So that's why I actually switched to stick from pad, and that's why I never went back to pad, is because of that. So no matter how sweaty my hands are on stick, the input is going to feel the same exact way every time, right? And then it'll help you be more consistent. But with this, doing this slide is very easy if your hands are not sweaty at all, because they're just going to slide across if your hands are dry, right? Or if my hands are extremely sweaty and slippery, this is also really easy. But if they're somewhere in between, like how they are right now, they're just a little bit sweaty, it makes them a bit grippier. This might sound ridiculous to you guys, but with them being just kind of grippy from being slightly sweaty, it actually changes the amount of force I have to apply. Because if I apply too much force here, my finger will kind of grip the keys here, and then I won't be able to do the slide here as fast as I would like to. So I have to deliberately do this more gently than I normally would whenever my hands are halfway sweaty. It's actually made me consider getting some of that climbing powder, the powder rock climbers put on their hands before climbing, so that way their hands aren't sweaty. Because if I were to dip my left index finger in climbing powder before ever tryharding in this game, it would standardize the amount of force I have to apply whenever I want to buffer this. So I might end up doing that if I ever want to play this game at really high level in tournaments or something. If I ever want to try hard that hard. I would say if I wanted to sweat at the game this hard, but my whole point is that I'm trying to make my finger not sweaty, right? So in the future, if you guys see me dipping my left index finger in climbing powder, that is why. But that is worth mentioning because as someone with sweaty hands, I don't really hear people talk about the inherent challenges with that, but I'm sure there are other people out there that have the same issue as me. The second con is that the natural beauty, you could say, the inherent beauty of playing on stick is that aside from it being more intuitive, is that because the game doesn't really require any specific spot for a full circle input, it just requires that you do a 3/4 circle, right? No matter where you start, is that you can start it from any direction on stick. So let's say you jump forward on stick, right? You're holding up forward. That means if you're holding up forward and you want to do an air grab, you can just go from up forward all the way around to down forward. And if you're holding down forward, right, let's say you're holding down forward to do a 3 input or something, but then you change your mind and you quickly want to do a 360 input on stick, you would just grab the stick that you're already holding on to and rotate it 3/4, which would end up being up forward, right? Obviously, you'd have to make sure you do it fast enough because you would have to press up. You would have to press up, back, and up forward. But the pre-jump frames in this game are pretty generous. So I'm pretty sure on stick, you could definitely go from 3 to up forward, doing a full circle that way, and you would still get the grab before jumping, right? But with this, that makes it a lot less intuitive, right? Like, let's say you're holding down back. Let's say you're guarding down back. On stick, this would be easy because, like I said, just apply what I just said, but make it on the other side, right? So if you're holding down back, you could then immediately buffer into a full circle by going from down back to down forward to up forward to up back. But on Leverless, it's a lot less intuitive because you're not actually drawing the shape of a circle, right? So it's possible to come up with other inputs if you wanted to do an SPD starting from different directions, such as down back. But personally, because I can input an SPD like this so fast, I don't know if it's necessarily worth it, which is why I don't think this is actually that big of a con, right? Because I can do this just as fast, if not faster, than doing this any kind of way on stick, even if I'm just starting from whatever direction I was holding on stick. I think it's much faster and easier on Leverless to just let go of that and start with forward and sliding my hand back. You know, or, well, okay, so you could instead let go of down and then slide your ring finger from back to forward. I haven't really trained my ring finger enough to do this confidently. So sometimes you might want to preemptively put your index finger over here, right? But if you're holding down back blocking, your index finger probably isn't going to be over here because then what finger's holding down, right? So in very specific niche situations like this, holding down back, and let's say you're not close enough to the opponent, right? Let's say you're not close enough to the opponent to grab with a light SPD and you're holding down back and you want to walk forward a little bit before doing the SPD. Usually, if you're just standing in neutral like this, that's the beauty of being able to do this, because this would even be true on stick, right? Because you could choose to start an SPD holding forward and then moving into back in case you want to block later, or you can start by holding back in case you want to block earlier and then press forward. Because remember, whenever you're doing a motion input which requires you to hold down forward or forward, you're not actually able to block, right? There's a risk/reward in that situation. You're putting yourself, you're making yourself open. You're leaving yourself open whenever you're doing a motion input, which doesn't allow you to hold down, back, or back, right? So, normally in neutral, you'd be able to choose, okay, let's say I want to get a little further away from him to maybe see if he whiffs something. I can do that, or I held it a bit too long. I'm trying to exaggerate it here. A little bit shorter than that. See, so I'm able to do a little micro walk back before grabbing him, or if I'm a little too far away and light SPD would whiff, I'm able to start from back and end with forward, so that way I walk forward a little bit to close the gap before pressing up and punch, right? But in a niche situation like holding down back from too far away to land a light SPD, you would want to start with back and slide it to forward, so that way you could get the little micro walk that I just did. But it's going to be kind of awkward holding down back, at least on this side. If I were on this side, it would be pretty easy, right? But let's say I'm on this side and I'm holding down back. It would be kind of awkward to let go of down and slide my ring finger. It's definitely possible, and you could definitely practice it, right? This is actually the first time I've ever really tried it in this video. I'm trying to see. I know it's possible, right? So I want to land it at least once. Yeah, see? So you can definitely do that, but it's a lot more awkward doing it with your ring finger. And also, one of the risks of doing this quickly is that if you're sliding your finger in this direction, obviously it's not that hard if you are using your index finger, because I've practiced it enough. But when you first start out, or if you're trying to use something like your ring finger, you are going to run into the risk of sliding your finger too far, and you're going to press one of these buttons, right? One of these buttons right here, because on Leverless, all these buttons are so close to each other. So that's something to keep in mind. But outside of really weird, specific niche situations like that, I don't think it's much of a con, but I have to mention it because that is one advantage a stick has. The third con is that traditionally, full circle inputs on stick are very telegraphed to your opponents if you are playing in person. So the arcade scene is a little bit before my time, but I've heard that in the arcade scene, if you were playing against someone on the same cabinet as yourself, then they would know when an SPD is coming, because not only would they hear the stick move around, but obviously it's a very involved task. You have to move your entire arm and hand in order to do a full circle input. And it also takes longer than something like a fireball. So you are giving your opponent an opportunity to react both audibly and visually. So that issue, that drawback with SPDs also carried into tournaments, right? Because if you were playing in a tournament in person with your opponent right next to you, or even on the other side of the table as you, and you're playing on stick, even if they can't see the stick, they can hear it, right? Which eventually led to a technique called it's called the Hajiki screw, or the Hijiki screw. It's named after the guy that started doing it. It's either Hajiki or Hijiki. And I actually have a stick here, so I can show you guys. I can show you what I'm talking about. So the Hijiki screw, instead of doing a full SPD like this, right? Instead of going from forward to down, back to up, back to up, assuming I'm starting from this direction, right? Or if I'm starting from up to forward, whatever. Instead of me manually inputting all of this, you would actually just do part of it, and then you would flick your hand. You would flick the stick, I mean. You would, there are videos for this, right? And I'm not going to get too in-depth with this because I'm talking about leverless here, not necessarily stick. But anyways, my point is that this was enough of an issue that people had to develop a new technique to mask their SPD input, because doing the Hijiki screw, the whole point is that it's not as visually noticeable. If you're just kind of flicking the stick and having the weight of the stick carry itself around the gate to get the rest of the inputs, your opponent isn't going to notice it as much as you just cranking on this thing churning butter, right? If you're standing here churning butter, your opponent is always going to see that. So, like I said, my point is that it's enough of an issue that people had to develop a new technique for it. Obviously, since the advent of people using pad at tournaments, that's not really been an issue because the I don't know if Itazan uses a stick or pad, actually. You guys can let me know in the comments. But I know with Snake Eyes, at least, Snake Eyes uses pad. And so doing a 360 on D-pad is never going to be noticeable, at least not more noticeable than any other kind of manual input on pad, right? Because this is super quiet and you're only moving your thumb. So anyways, this is all to say that doing an SPD on leverless, I think, is actually the most telegraphed of them all. Obviously, it's more telegraphed than pad. I don't need to explain why in that case, right? But I actually think it's more telegraphed than on stick because, as I showed you guys, you can do the Hijiki screw technique on stick, whereas I don't know if you can really do something like that on leverless. Obviously, you can try to mask it by just doing it a little bit more subtly, like that. But because you're sliding your finger across these things, you can probably already hear it on the mic. It's very audible. So visually, it's not as noticeable as churning butter on a stick. But I think audibly, that's a pretty big warning. Keep in mind, though, that on this leverless controller, this Snackbox Micro, I have inside of it the default stock switches that it comes with. I think it's Cherry Red switches, Cherry Red MX switches or something like that. I'm not an expert when it comes to keyboard switches, but you can look at the store page on the Junk Food Arcade website and see which switches these controllers come with stock, right? So if you are concerned about telegraphing your SPDs to an opponent in a real-life tournament or something like that, using a leverless controller, you could invest in some quieter switches. I have done that myself because I don't really have any kind of local scene where I live, so I don't need to worry about that. But I would encourage you guys to let me know how that works out if you do invest in quieter switches. I actually kind of like switches being louder. I typically like loud controllers just because it gives me more audio-visual feedback whenever I'm doing something. But if I had to worry about playing people in a real tournament, then I would probably consider investing in some quieter switches. So I'd imagine that getting quieter switches would make this less telegraphed. So again, this isn't that big of a con, but worth mentioning. As for tiger kneeing your SPDs, as I was alluding to earlier, you can still do that on leverless just as you would on stick. So when you do the input on the ground, make sure you end with either up, forward, up, or up, back. So that way you jump. Make sure you're holding it just barely long enough to jump. And then as soon as you lift off of the ground, press the punch button to do it as low to the ground as possible, right? It's really easy to do it from around this height, because you can actually react to the jump if you're doing it around this height. That was really high, but this height is pretty easy. But you can even do it lower to the ground, which is pretty crazy like that. That's super low, right? But I don't think there's really much need to ever do it that low to the ground. I think around this height is fine, because even though you can use this to anti-air certain things, I don't think it's the best anti-air, because the timing is really tricky against a lot of things. If you're trying to use this as an anti-air, a lot of things will beat it. It's very inconsistent as an anti-air. So I think most of the time, if you want to tiger knee this, most of the time, it is because you are predicting a jump. Like, let's say you put them in a mix-up situation and you notice that a lot of times your opponent is jumping because they don't want to have to eat a grounded SPD. So if you've conditioned them into jumping on your plus frames, you would just do something like that to call out their jump, right? But the times in which you actually do need to do this really low to the ground, it's going to be in combos, specifically with the EX version, so something like this. That was a little late. The timing's kind of tricky in combos. Let me see if I can get it. Whoops, too early. See, like that. I still need to practice it myself, obviously, right? And in the corner, you have things like, if they block. This one's a lot harder. Or, not punish counter. Block all, or block all. So you can combo EX Lariat here into EX Air SPD, but of course you have to time it right. Like that, see? So I'm still practicing that whenever I'm waiting in ranked queue because I don't think I can ever get that consistent enough. But obviously, as you can see, you would just do the normal SPD input and hold up. What makes this tricky is that Lariat has so much recovery in this game, even EX Lariat has so much recovery that you're going to be holding up for a long time. So you want to make sure that you input the half circle late enough. You want it to be late enough that it's close enough to when you jump, right? Because if you input this too early, let's say I input the half circle as soon as the EX Lariat connects, and then I'm just sitting around waiting, holding up. By the time I actually jump and press punch, the game will have forgotten the forward, down, back input, right? So if I were to press the half circle part of the SPD input too early, it would look something like this. See? So by the time I finally jump and press both buttons, I get a regular attack because the game forgot that I did this because it was so long ago. And of course, if you know how to do a 360 input, that means by proxy, you also know how to do a 720 input because it's literally the same thing. Just make sure that if you develop the muscle memory of pressing punch whenever you press up after doing this, that you deliberately refrain from pressing punch until you do the second full circle, right? Because I actually had to fight that muscle memory myself because you do SPDs so much more often than you do a 720 super. So I have to always tell myself mentally to not press the punch button when you press up the first time, right? Because you're going to have to pass by up once and then you're going to press up again for the second full circle. And of course, just like on stick, when you are doing a 720 input, you are going to have to make sure you do it during a jump or during a move that locks you into the ground like that, because otherwise you're going to jump in the middle of the input because even if you end the input with up, you're going to have to pass by up in the previous circle, right? Obviously. So it would look something like this. Whoops, did it too early. Like that, right? Or during a move, it would look like this. Simple enough. Of course, if you are playing on modern controls like myself, you can just do a one-button 720 like this for less damage, and you don't have to worry about masking the input. But of course, this video is about doing the inputs manually for the full damage, so this is beside the point. Anyways, thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know if you found this video helpful, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask them in the comments, because like I mentioned earlier, I decided to re-record this video with the assumption that most people watching it would be around an intermediate level or above. So if you do have any questions, just let me know in the comments, and with all that said, I will see you guys later, so bye for now.